My name is Dr. Khan. I'm one of the faculty here at the Indian Institute for Human Settlements, and I just want to welcome you all here. It's always wonderful to see this room full. We call this series Publics, and it's our attempt at IIHS to try and be good citizens to the city in which we have recently tried to settle ourselves in. We're still finding our feet, still sort of introducing ourselves, so it's like an awkward first date, but hopefully it'll go well and we'll see more of you. And I think that, we've had a range of really excellent events in the public series so far, and this is pretty much the icing on the cake. I think each of us individually has been chasing Lawrence for about 2 years now to grab him somewhere or the other. So I'm very, very happy to see him. He needs very little introduction, but I'm going to introduce him because he's just informed me that I can finally formally introduce him as Dr. Lawrence Liang. He's about to defend at JNU, so it's pretty much like that. Except he's also told me his PhD is currently 450 pages long. So that may be your only sticking point. But Lawrence is, as you know, part of Bangalorean from the Alternative Law Forum, came out of National Law School and then was at the University of Warwick, and now about to finish at JNU on his PhD. Lawrence has been writing and working particularly on questions of intellectual property for a very long time, and many of you have read his writings, particularly on issues of creative commons, of knowledge production, of boundaries and geographies of knowledge, on thinking about questions of public access, and really rethinking the notion of intellectual property and unmooring it from some of its too close connections to the other kind of property that we in Indian cities are very familiar with, which is privately owned and guarded and enclave real estate. Lawrence has also done a tremendous amount of writing on cinema, law, and justice, and I think that's the subject of a lot of his work in his PhD. And in doing so, he's really looked, I think, fascinatingly at the idea of the visual and the question of how reading the city is not just a question of method, but actually changes the way you imagine, live, experience, and understand the city. And I think it's the question of taking visuality beyond method, and it's the adding media and stirring to an otherwise very traditional canon of urban studies, that he's really broken a lot of new ground for any of us who's interested in studying the city, in living in the city, working the city, and trying to find a relationship and how to read and think about the urban. He's one of the few people I know personally who have their own Wikipedia page, which I always find deeply exciting. He cooks one of the most fantastic Chinese New Year feasts that you have ever had, and so he's worth becoming friends with or without his consent, just to secure an invitation out to one of those feasts. Lawrence and I are part of a group blog called Kafila, in which we both write, and we've been around that from the beginning, and his writing on that is part of a much larger body of public intellectual work. And the one good thing about someone who works on free intellectual property is that you can actually read their work, because it's not hidden away in copyrighted journals that none of us can afford. And I think so that's very much a question of the medium and the message coming together. Before I hand over to him, about his talk today called Comics and the Urban Imagination, I wanted to just give you a brief context of IIHS. IIHS is a prospective national university and an education institution, and we hope to try and create an institution and a space that creates and pushes interdisciplinary approaches to looking at the city, particularly the Indian and South Asian city and the city of the Global South, and very much thinking about, I'll say to the displeasure of some of my colleagues and their training, to rescue the city from its spatial reduction to planning, architecture, and design, and to really bring back, and I think this talk is part of that tradition, to really think about the city as a much more complex and layered space, built by a whole range of practitioners that come from very different places in the way that they work in the city. So I'll stop there. Just logistics, the restrooms are to the left. I request you all to please put your cell phones on silent and take a moment to do so now. Lawrence, yeah.
Thank you. What I'm going to do today is that before I actually jump into the meat of the topic, which is really about comics and cities, I'm going to spend a little time evaluating in a way where kind of comic studies is at the moment. Because in some senses, comic studies is a very, very incipient area. It's surprising, given how long the medium has been around, that there's actually been very little scholarly work done on this. And it's only the last decade and a half or so that we've actually had scholarly interest in the study of comics. And there's a whole range of reasons for that. One of this is the fact that comics, because of their historic association with children's literature, and especially the genre of superheroes, have always been seen to be a flippant genre, incapable of producing the same kind of insights that other works of art, whether it's painting or music and movies, are capable of. And a lot of what we see happening in comic studies in the last decade and a half is really an attempt to kind of assert an aesthetic legitimacy of its own. And this happens, and it's familiar. You've seen this happen in film studies, in its early phase, with the creation of a canon, the establishment of auteurs. The use of the term graphic novel in recent times is one way of legitimizing graphic novels as being kind of serious and worthy of attention, as opposed to comics. So a whole bunch of things that are happening. But the most interesting one is really the ontological question, which a number of people looking at comics are asking, which is, do they have a medium specificity? Is there something that can be done in comics that cannot be done in any other medium? And I think this is really the big challenge. Around 20 years ago, Umberto Eco wrote an article about peanuts, and it was a fantastic article which should have prompted a wave of serious studies of comics, but unfortunately didn't. And I want to read that extract to you. Eco writes, and he's talking about Charles Schulz, he doesn't drink, he doesn't smoke, he doesn't swear. He was born in Minnesota in 1922. He's married and has 5 children, I believe. He works alone, has no neurosis of any kind. This man, whose life is so disastrously normal, is named Charles Schulz, and he's a poet. When I say poet, I say it because I'm sure it'll make some people mad. The professional humanists who don't read comic strips, and those who accuse intellectuals who do of being snobs when they claim to like them. But this much should be clear. If poetry means the capacity of carrying tenderness, pity, wickedness to moments of extreme transparence, as if things passed through a light and there were no telling anymore what substance they're made of, then Schulz is a poet. If poetry means fixing typical characters in typical circumstances, Schulz is a poet. If poetry means producing from everyday events which we identify with the surface of things, a revelation that causes us to touch the depth of things, then every so often Schulz is a poet. And if poetry were merely finding a particular rhythm and improvising on it in a ceaseless adventure of infinite variations, making a constantly new universe from the otherwise mechanical encounter of 2 or 3 elements, well, in this case, Schulz is a poet, more so than many others. And anyone who's read Peanuts knows this. Between a handful of characters who are going to repeat the same thing, you know for a fact that every single time, Charlie Brown attempts to come and kick the ball, he's not going to succeed. And if he were to succeed, then it wouldn't be the world of Peanuts. There is this extreme kind of, sense almost of despair, but it's a despair that, in a way, has become so much kind of a part of the rhythmic universe of Peanuts. So, interestingly, despite the fact that a number of people have, in a way, kind of seriously written about comics, it's only in the recent years that this has really emerged. So what's the consequence of this? One of this is that a number of the claims that are made about comics now end up kind of trying to be definitionally kind of absolute. So we offer this kind of the definite account of what a comic is, what is the medium, what is its power, etc. And this is again something from film that one knows that any claim on medium specificity always comes with a certain problem. Right? There are a lot of critics within film studies like Noel Carroll who will talk about the impossibility of making a claim about the specificity of just one single medium. Comic studies has struggled, in a sense, with the inheritance of a language of a number of disciplines, and primarily that of film studies. So if you take the way that people speak about comics, people very often talk about camera angles, they talk about zooming, they talk about framing, etc. Now all of this, in describing the compositional kind of drawing, even though there is no camera involved in the construction of the image. Another difficulty that comics pose for academics is really something that it shares with cinema, which is the complexity of paraphrasing comics. Very often the focus is on the narrative element without any attention to the comic form. So you always have people narrating the story of a comic, but how do you actually talk about how the comic does what it does? So for me, I believe that it's very important for us to start looking at ways in which one can start thinking and speaking about comics, both by virtue of their cultural kind of importance and the range of serious work that has emerged in the last few years, but also because as a form, they speak to the contemporary in very interesting ways. Comics are a multimodal form of expression which combines a whole range of arts. It combines the art of drawing and painting, whether in the form of caricature to abstraction or photorealism, the layout elements of print media, the verbal tropes of literature, the visual language of film, the storytelling of serials, and then they transform all of these into something different from their uses in other media. Now, while often compared to cinema, I think there's a crucial difference between cinema and comics, in that cinematic images unfold in time, but in comics they unfold in space. So what does it mean to actually look at this idea of the temporal unfolding of something on a page, on a layout, on page after page, etc.? So what are some of the big questions in comic studies? Is it primarily a visual medium, a textual medium, or a combination of both? And what does it mean to speak of it being a combination of both? Is it possible to have an argument about it doing things that no other medium can do? Is there an ontology of comics just as there is an ontology of cinema? Stanley Cavell, the American philosopher, in his work on the ontology of cinema, claims that cinema's uniqueness lies in the fact that cinema screens the world to you, even as it screens you away from the world. So the particularity of the experience of actually watching something in the context of this idea of what it means to view the world, right? What is an ontology of comics? There isn't one in terms of an articulated, express kind of ontology, but there are a number of practitioners who speak about their craft. Joe Sacco, a very popular kind of comic journalist, for example, speaks about the distinction between drawings and photography. And his argument is that photography makes us see too much, and the camera sees too much. It captures everything. And the ubiquity of images and comics and cameras in our lives actually make us see less. So this ironical or this paradoxical thing of the image being too much so you see much lesser. So he sees drawings as a form of subtraction. What does it mean to actually subtract away and to arrive at a perceptual plane? In other words, if photography has always been about an indexical relation to a moment or to a time, a drawing is always a moment after, right? Michael Tofsik, the anthropologist, similarly says of the difference between the two modes, where he says that whenever we talk about photography, we talk about taking a photograph, but you never take a drawing. You always make a drawing. And what's the difference between the taking and the making in that case? For Tofsik, a photograph stops time while a drawing encompasses it. So unlike photographs whose realism and historicism ground them as objects in and off time, drawings are not literal documents but filtered perceptions. And what you then have with the history of comics is a history of perceptual experiences of a particular moment. It's almost like the lingering after effect of what you see. You can miss a moment in a photograph if you don't have your camera with you. But with a drawing, it's not the moment as much as the aspect of capturing a certain idea of encompassing time that flows after. If cinema relied on the idea of variable framing, which is that the camera frames what it is that you see, then how do we think about the nature of the drawing? How does the drawing encompass time? How does the drawing encompass experience? The medium of comics is a very tricky one because on the one hand, comics suggest motion but are incapable of showing it. They indicate sound, pow, blam, but they are a silent medium. They imply a passage of time, but the temporal control is really in the hands of the reader. And they convey continuity, but they're really a series of discrete moments. You can see this, for example, in choices made by a very interesting architectural group in Hong Kong called the MAP Project. The MAP Project has been kind of drawing and documenting changes that have been taking place in South China. And the methodology that they follow really is to go to a place, photograph it, but always render the photograph in the form of a drawing, right? So this is their account of Shenzhen, and literally where, and this is not sequential, I put it sequentially, but in their book this really kind of comes across in discrete moments. So two of the most important people in terms of, and I wanted to compare this with, a drawing by Solly Benjamin, who's an urbanist, in his account of the evolution of squatter colonies, and you can see a lot of similarities in this. Two of the most important theorists of comics have really been Will Eisner, in some ways the godfather of kind of, the graphic novel because he coined the term, and Scott McCloud. I'm going to focus on just 2 or 3 elements before I then jump into, the relationship between comics and cities. But Scott McCloud has, in a way, kind of come up with what is perhaps the definitive account, highly contested, but a very, very useful one because it's also in the form of a comic. And there are a couple of things that he identifies as being unique to the medium of the comic. The first one is the definitional one. Will Eisner had defined comics as kind of, sequential visual art. What McCloud does with it is that he runs with this and tries to really layer it out and kind of, nuance this definition. But one of the things that he claims is that you might say that before it's projected, film is just a very, 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 very slow comic, right? So if you were to take away the temporality of cinema in terms of the 24 frames a second, and you were to look at it, then you'd see them as sequential visual art. But the key argument for him was the first one, that this is sequential visual art. The second argument that he made is the argument of iconicity. And he has a very complex kind of a pyramid, in a way, between the simplest drawing, which is the smiley face, and why it is that we're so easily able to identify even with something as simple as a circle, 2 dots, and a kind of a line, for us to immediately identify it with a certain kind of anthropocentric or a human character, to the most complicated in terms of the closest that you can get to a photorealism. And to give you one example, this is from Fable's 1001 Nights. In a single comic, you will have a range of possible iconic forms in the representation of the human character. So from the left on top there, you can see the drawing there, very close in a way to a certain kind of a realism, to the, of course, the very complicated, the ones in the middle, which are much more cartoony. So this distinction in a way between the cartoony elements to, of course, the idea of closer to realism, also in a way is a debate within comics of a certain kind, especially mirroring the entire debate around realism in cinema. The main argument for me that Scott McCloud produces in his argument about the specificity of the medium is his theorizing of the gap. So his argument is that how do comics in a way perform the function of time? And his claim is that the function of time in comics is produced by the gap, or what is called the gutter, the space between panels. His argument is that there is an inherent kind of a reader collaboration when you look at comics, because it's the reader that fulfills or closes the gap that exists between 2 panels. So the imaginative leap that you make between one panel to the other is really the act of, in a way, the reader producing meaning out of that particular comic. And that, of course, can be manipulated in very, very different ways. I mean, just to give you one example of this is the classic one that we all know, right? I mean, the iconic kind of thing. But if you look at the way that the gap functions, of course, these are a series of montages. They're not kind of, necessarily sequential in the way that they're linear, but that gap is filled very easily. This is the recognizable one. But if you look at another one, this is Sean Tan, The Arrival. Absolutely brilliant comic. But you look at the way that he works it, and it's not even as close in terms of the linearity of, let's say, the Batman. The Batman one, they go for a movie, they come out, the movie was Mask of Zorro, they come out, parents are dead, he's become an orphan, and then he becomes Batman. You know that story. But when you look at the Arrival and look at the way that the kind of, the gap functions, for one, you're not entirely sure how to navigate the space. The conventional way of navigating the space, which is from the top left moving down, in that kind of way to the right bottom, is something that has now completely been challenged by a whole range of people. So in Sean Tan, you will see that movement happens, and then finally there is this kind of, for lack of a better word, the zooming out that takes place. The third argument that Scott McCloud makes about the uniqueness of comics is really about their temporality. And this there's a whole bunch of other things that I'm going to skip for time, which is that in thinking about the movement between panels, how do you think about choice of moment, choice of frame, etc. I'm not going to go into all of that. But if you take this single image that Scott McCloud uses, he says this is a very complicated image for the simple reason that while the act of reading it sequentially makes you read it from smile to, sure you want to move that there, Jed, right? But is there a linearity in this moment? In other words, is this happening sequentially in terms of time? Or could it be the case that the chess game or the checkers game is actually happening before the moment when someone takes that camera? What about the middle? Are they talking about the moment before or the moment after? the idea of the smile, etc. So one of the unique things about comics that Scott McCloud claims is that because of the fact of the temporal unfolding of time in a spatial manner allows you a wide range of choices in the ways that you can actually play with how the reader perceives and experience the experience of time and space. He says if you were to illustrate this in terms of an image, this is what happens in comics. That there is this kind of entanglement that is possible. And one of the ways of discipline in this is, of course, by the gutter. If you just put a gutter in the same image, you suddenly have a sequential moment that unfolds in a very, very kind of clear way. Very quick example of a single story and how you can have different examples or perspectives on this. This is Matt Madden's 99 Ways to Tell a Story. This is the frame story. Man is working on a computer, he gets up, he goes down, someone says, what time is it? Is it 1:15, thanks? And he goes to the fridge and says, what the hell was I looking for anyway? Now, look at the ways in which you can actually play around with perspective on this. So this one becomes, for example, a subjective point of view account of the same story. But you see immediately that the choice then of the paneling, the choice of the gutter changes. This one becomes an externalized third-person point of view of the same event. Someone looking at it from outside. This is the manga style with the mandatory, teeny girls, panties, etc. This is a single panel. All of the information that was contained in the first narrative is all here, but in a single moment, right? And this is the collapsing in a way of time. This is one which, and I'll come when I talk about Chris Ware's work, I'll talk about it a lot more, where it's really, really dense in terms of the kind of visual information that you have. There are no gutters, it's almost as though we're flowing into each other. But what do you think about here in terms of the unfolding of time? Because this really becomes about that single moment that really stretches. In other words, it slows down time, right? This one, of course, through the use of the vertical kind of panels and the very narrow gutter between the two really kind of creates this into a kind of an experience of anxiety, right? The most important here is to emerge, speaking about in a way a kind of a comprehensive theory of comics, as theory Ronstein. In his system of comics, which is an attempt to articulate the language of comics, Ronstein argues for an approach that privileges the visual rather than the textual in the consideration of comics. But he's not using the idea of the visual just in terms of pictures. He has a very specific way in which he understands or articulates the idea of the visual, which is not reducible to individual drawings or panels. Ronstein categorizes or characterizes comics as a language, and he refuses any attempt to reduce comics to groups of component elements. For Ronstein, within the paged multiframe that constitutes a complete comic, every panel exists potentially, if not actually, in relation to each of the others. This totality, where the physical form is generally that of an album, responds to a model or organization that is not that of the strip, nor that of the chain, but that of the network. So Ronstein cites the juxtaposition of images within comics as the primary barrier of narrative signification. And although he allows that comics may have meaning of its own, he stresses that for comics it's really the space between panels and the relationship of articulation between them that creates the meaning of the comic. So the two key ideas that Ronstein argues about, the first one is what he would describe as the spatio-topical system. The spatio-topical system is in a way kind of borrows its kind of terminology from an understanding in architecture, which attempts to speak to the uniqueness of comics by shifting away from the idea of the text or the image relation and looking at the structure of the medium to create an argument of how they do what they do. In other words, it takes a claim for the primacy of space and place and how the aesthetic effect of the panel, the gutter, the frame, and the margin locations are central to the operational logic of comics. He uses the reverse metaphor of the Matryoshka doll, the Russian doll, to argue that the smallest unit of signification, the panel, can connect and rhyme with the larger structures like the tire, the page, the double spread, and even the multi-frame of the entire comic. The second one, and to give you a couple of examples of the complexities that people have deployed in thinking about the idea of the panel and its relation to time. This is Jeff Smith's marvelous Bones. I mean, this is not from the comic, but this is his thing. So it says, hey, there you guys go, I was talking to you, hey. And it's obviously a part of the same image, but he's just framed it. So it's good thing he had this extra panel, Boris Smiley. I couldn't take much more of his whining. Enjoy it while you can. This panel is only 10 minutes ahead of the one he's in. Right? Very, very playful kind of way of trying to look at how the spatio-topical system here is something that kind of is able to subdivide time in a very, very different way. This is Alan Moore's Watchmen, classic that everyone has read, 101 of graphic novels, you pick up Watchmen or Mouse, right? That's the starting point for everyone. This is much more cinematic. It clearly borrows its conventions from the zoom out, right? So the little smiley face that becomes the kind of the motif that runs through the comic is the first panel, and then everything kind of zooms out. But if you were to contrast it, even with a single panel like this is Karl Barks's DuckTales, you'll find that what you have here that cinema doesn't offer you is really a multi-perspective, right? Because here it's again very playful because it says, look out in front of you, look out behind you, watch out on this side. Almost as if we're inviting you to think about what it is that you see and how you see the moment you enter, encounter a panel. This is Adam Hines' Duncan the Wonder Dog. Again, the spillover, as it were, from photorealist moment, which is the archival newspaper print, to the way that the arrangement of the text, not in a single panel, but as something that kind of unites, as it were, the panels. So what is the function then of the text in the way that it flows across various kinds of panels? And one of the ways of thinking about this is, if you were to link this to the history of modern art, this of course is Mondrian's kind of very famous painting. And you look at Mondrian's arrangement, it almost, as it were, looks like a blank comic page, right? It's colors distributed according to particular panels, both in terms of size, and the effect of the painting is really on its ability to utilize color in relation to each other, but really as a spatio-topical system, right? And this, of course, is a playful version of it. It's a way of kind of recreating Mondrian as what he originally ought to be, which is that of a comic. And you can see the influences. This is in Clive Barker's work, where a lot of this breaking down of what we traditionally understand to be the borders of a page, which is the kind of, the gutters, etc. This doesn't really have a gutter. So what happens then to the experience of the comic in this case? Neil Gaiman's Violent Cases, again, the narrator who runs through it, but also a challenge to the ways that you read, because the visual information along with the textual information is all about an overload. There's too much information. So how are you actually going to read this in any kind of sequential manner? Will Eisner was the pioneer of it. He was the one who first kind of did away with the entire idea of paneling itself. This is again Lucifer, which is a sequel to the Sandman series. And then finally Alison Bechdor's Fun Home, where the emergence of a photograph, but one that is marked by a hand or a finger holding it, very much almost like the famous kind of paintings of the hand painting the hand, etc. Again, how do you actually move this entire thing? So the first concept that Ronsi talks about is the idea of the spatial topical system. The second one is that of arthology. Arthology is a term that he derives from the Greek for the study of articulation, especially in relation to the study of joints. So arthritis, and it comes from arthology, it's about the study of joints. So his interest is how does arthology provide us a way of figuring out the foundation upon which we can appreciate an organic totality that associates a complex combination of elements, parameters, and multiple procedures. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into it, but there are two components that are crucial to him: the idea of gridding and the idea of braiding. So he really tries to understand this in kind of spatial terms of how do images braid with each other. And the best way for me to do this is by doing a close reading of one particular comic, which is going to be Asterios Polyp by David Mazzucchelli. But just a couple of examples. This is Alan Moore's Promethea. You can recognize very easily the Mobius strip, right? So he uses the idea of the Mobius strip as a way of narrative unfolding. This is Chris Ware's Acme Novelty Store, which actually is literally about a box. It's about how do you, when you unpack a box, the instruction kit, how do you actually use that. So let me look at how some of these theories play out in the reading of one particular comic, and this is, Mazzucchelli's Asterios Polyp. Mazzucchelli was the illustrator for Batman Year One with Frank Miller, Daredevil, etc. In other words, as mainstream as you can get in terms of a rock star of the comic world. But when he breaks free, the first comic that he does is Paul Auster's City of Glass, followed by Asterios Polyp. Now, to give you a quick background on Asterios Polyp, here's the summary story. Asterios is this kind of extremely talented genius kind of architect and professor of architecture. He's never ever made a building, but he's made many plans for buildings that have won many awards, right? Asterios is also a hardcore formalist who believes in strong ideas of binaries, so he's all into binaries, right? And the story begins with Asterios' house catching fire and him moving into a small town to work as a mechanic. And then this is interspersed with the story of his relationship to his wife Hannah, who has left him. Hannah is the contrast of Asterios. She's a designer and is everything that Asterios isn't. Doesn't believe in binaries, doesn't believe in dualities, etc. The mythic structure that runs through Asterios Polyps is the Odyssey, it's Orpheus' descent to the underworld, and it's also Plato's Symposium. So you can see the formal choices now coming into play with Asterios being drawn. Whenever Asterios speaks, his speech bubbles are extremely straight lines, they're boxes, because it's very clear, right? He's kind of a modelist with a human face, right? As his own book says it. There are a number of visual clues that are constantly left behind. So in the early kind of thing of Asterios, you'll see that there's Humpty Dumpty, there's Romulus Remus, there is, the books that they talk about is like, the Man in the Iron Mask. The reason for this is Asterios believes that he has a twin brother who he killed in order to come to the world, which is borrowing from Nigerian myth that all of us kill a twin to come to the world, and we are haunted by the presence of the death of ourselves even as we are born into the world, right? So there is so the narrative is really about Asterios coming to terms in a way with this other self of his. Now, one of the reasons I find Asterios very interesting is, for me, it is in some ways a meta-comic. It's a comic about how one reads comics, because the entire idea behind Asterios is really about perception. Okay, so if you were to look at Bronstein's idea of the narrative braiding, you'll see that there are all these visual motifs of the twin. So his house is like the twin towers, there's always a twin that runs into his thing, because his life is always about binaries. How does Mazzucchelli look at people? He looks at them as a range of characters of this form. On the one hand, let's say Hannah, on the other hand, someone like Asterios Polyp, extremely straight lines. So in the classroom, characters are also equally, divided, as it were, into these kind of different personality types. This is his first meeting with Hannah. Asterios, of course, is this brilliant genius who's the center of everyone's attention, etc. And the contrast is Hannah, who is always accustomed in a way to be out of the spotlight, right? So when Hannah and Asterios meet, they completely, in terms of the way that they're represented, he maintains that kind of formality. But since this is a story really about the idea of relationships, it's a story about the idea of marriage, what does it mean in a way to think about this idea of the union of two different selves? What does it mean, following from Plato's Symposium, to think about the idea of the dissolution of the self, right? The contrast of their rooms, again, extremely clear. And these are all not sequential, so they're taken from different points, just to show you how there's a certain kind of a rhythm within the comic that keeps kind of... So this is the time when they meet in her place for the first time, and he compliments her on her design, and immediately then professes a theory about it, right? The spotlight immediately shifts from her to him, so you can see that the spotlight that has established her early on gets kind of replicated here. And then at a very, very important moment in the comic, Hannah is teaching a class in which she has a number of students, and she asks them to look at two bricks and ask them what they see. And of course, and how many do you see? And everyone answers 2. And then she says that it's 3, because what you don't see, but as a part of the relationship between the two bricks, is of course the space between the two bricks, right? Now, as a novel or as a comic that's really about this idea of relationships, as well as the idea of spatial practice, this becomes a crucial kind of a puzzle, because each of the chapters in the comic also begins with a little preface of a drawing. And one of them, for example, is these 2 flowers, because Hana literally means flower in Japanese. And what is it that you see, or how many flowers do you see? The 2 flowers. But if you know that she's already taught you that there is a space between the 2 flowers, and what you see is a silhouette of Hana. So the entire novel really becomes about what it means to actually look at one's idea of perception, and what is the blind spot. In neurology, the blind spot is a space where the optic nerve touches the retina, and this is the point where we don't see anything at all, a spot of no vision in the field of vision. Jean-Luc Nancy says of cinema that cinema has an evidentiary value precisely because it's an eye-opener in its ability to overcome our blind spot. But for him, The blind spot is not something that deprives the eye its ability to see. On the contrary, it makes an opening of a gaze and presses upon it to look. He characterizes films as eye-openers because they allow us, paradoxically, to see a form of blindness. In Asterios Polyps, the question of Asterios' recognition of his own limited perception really becomes a challenge of how you see. And the comic becomes a mode through which you're constantly, as readers, also being asked what it is and how it is that you see. So these are very quick ones I'll run through, which is the collapse of the marriage. This is when, so when they're married and in a happy state, there's a merger of this pink and the blue form that they have, and increasingly that becomes more distant till, of course, the breakup itself, right? Each character is given its uniqueness by the choice of the font and the way that they kind of come out. So you have this musician who of course has a font of his own. There's this kind of pompous little theater director, a character of its own. There's a new age, kind of the wife of the mechanic that Asterios used to work with, who's all kind of flowery and curvy, etc. And she's responsible in a way for the transformation of Asterios' own self-knowledge. The comic ends with an asteroid destroying their house, right? And this is again crucial because earlier in the comic, Asterios very, very kind of confidently had rubbished a theory of someone who claimed that an asteroid was going to fall to the earth because of the relationship to dinosaurs. So it ends with that. But one of the marvelous ways in which time unfolds in the comic is that this is a 6-page sequence about the ordinary life that they led together. And of course it doesn't move in terms of the panel in terms of a single page, but it moves across the pages so that the moments that are unfolding are across in 3 layers in a way of very ordinariness of time there. Okay, I'm not going to talk too much more about this because I want to now jump into the comics and cities, which is allegedly what this talk is about. Okay, and I trust, I promise that I will try and not take up too much time. Okay, so very quickly in terms of history, from a production perspective, the history of comics has always been tied to the history of cities. In its modern avatar, it emerged with the rise of newspapers at the turn of the 19th century, and many of the pioneering comics were really about life in the big city, documenting the transformations that were taking place. The emergence of the superhero genre really begins to give the city a distinct character, and we know this very clearly from Batman and Superman. You look at the contrast of Gotham City and Metropolis, very clear, right? Batman is the dark, evil underside, etc., whereas Superman is always the goody two-shoes. In kind of, urban terms, planned, unplanned. Okay, you can see the distinction also in terms of the ways that the city as backdrop works. In Batman, there is always this sense of, the threat, the danger, all of that, whereas in Metropolis, it's always kind of clean and nice. As the Riddler once put it, when is a man a city? When it's Batman or when it's Gotham? It's huge and contradictory and dark and funny and threatening. Now, while Gotham is a thinly veiled version of New York, it's interesting to see how many people have attempted to map the warped mental and virtual scape of Gotham into New York. Dennis O'Neil in the Back Bible describes Gotham as a distillation of everything that's dark, moody, and frightening about New York. It's Hell's Kitchen, the Lower East Side, Bed-Stuy, the South Bronx, Soho, and Tribeca of the main thoroughfares at 3 in the morning. William Safire, the New York Times journalist, describes Gotham City as New York below 14th Street, from Soho to Greenwich Village, Bowery, Little Italy, Chinatown, and the sinister areas around the base of Manhattan and Brooklyn bridges. So this kind of attempt in a way to map, as it were, this kind of virtual kind of space onto a real map. Now the question is, do comics have a special competence for capturing urban space and city life and representing it aesthetically because of their hybrid nature? John Arons and Arno Mettling argue that the distinction between comics and pre-modern picture stories is the modernity of comics, that is, the medium's urbanity. Comics do not demand the contemplative as well as the fixed gaze of the classical central perspective of painting. Instead, what they demand is the loose moving gaze of the urban flaneur. They transport the text into the vertical and therefore decentralize the image. One theorist whose work in a way prophesized what would become very important in comic theory was Walter Benjamin, and we shall see that he exerts a very strong influence on Indian comic artists like Salman Banerjee. In 1928, Benjamin, describing the way that writing is omnipresent, says that it basically urbanity dragged text into the city. where the city becomes a constant kind of, explosion of a flood of changing, colorful, rivaling letters demanding the attention of the urban observer to look and read at the same time, at least if he plans to account for the ensemble of urban pleasures as a whole and complete experience. So the idea of the look and read at the same time, which is really what the hybridity of the text-image relationship in comics is about. Perception for Benjamin arises from distraction, right? And the symptom of reading a city and the reading of a comic in a way is clear in Benjamin, because what he's really asking for is how the idea of a certain kind of a filtering of the hyper-visual information that one has operates very neatly in the realm of comics. In the early comics, you can see, for example, even someone like Winsor McCay's Little Nemo, which is generally about extremely wondrous dreamscapes. Little Nemo is a page which is always about a kid who falls asleep, has a fantastic dream, and wakes up. That's the standard format. But there are some where you can see him, for example, attempting in a way to look down from a high building like the World Trade Center, reminding us of Michel Desserteau's argument or on the practice of walking, where he describes the contrast between the God's perspective from atop the World Trade Center and what it actually means to make a space a place by walking, and what the act of walking into as a complete contrast to the experience of looking at it from a planner's perspective or from God's perspective from atop. A couple of key figures of the early period. You see Franz Masserin's woodcuts called The City, a lot of which was about, again, capturing kind of the urban transformations that were taking place. Lynn Ward's extremely kind of influential expressionist kind of drawings of city life become a key kind of influence on noir films of that period, and remain to this date a strong influence. And you have this on Frank Miller's Sin City, clearly drawing in a way from that expressionist noir tradition, etc. But the main figure, of course, Will Eisner. Will Eisner, in a way, both defined, let's say, contemporary comics, as well as a certain relationship between urban aesthetics and the form of the comic itself. Will Eisner's comics are populated by streets, buildings, walls, and windows, which are all incorporated into the logic of his painting. Eisner's New York was a city that enclosed people into modules through standardized domiciles in the form of apartment buildings and routinized work schedules in factories. Eisner's comics explore the multiple forms of urban compartmentalization and containment by presenting these melodramatic narratives of people trapped both by their spatial as well as their social circumstances. So if you look at a couple of the Eisner drawings, an Eisner drawing is not a painting, it's not a photograph, but it is a very distinct history in a way of New York City. So in a series called Windows, you can almost, as it were, see the logic of the paneling that comes in, right? So a lot of his stories are really about the line where between the idea of the window as a certain kind of a paneling of perception to the outside world as well as from the outside world. A lot of his drawings incorporate very formally the idea of urban architecture and urban spatial practices into the layout of the comic itself, right? So he has another series called Walls. The contemporary inheritor of the Eisner legacy for me is Chris Ware. Chris Ware, in an article that's written about Chris Ware, it's titled, "Why Does Chris Ware Hate Fun?" And I think this is a very, very pertinent one, because if anyone ever thought that comics are about funnies, if they thought it's about fun and games, you need to read, Chris Ware, because it's as close as you can get to watching one of these horrible, French New Wave films that want to make you slit your throat. So Chris Ware is really, in some ways, again, a similar formal experimentation with slowing down perception. If Will Eisner was attempting to capture the kinetic energy of the city in the 30s and the 40s, Chris Ware's radical politics emerges from his ability to actually engage with slowness. So Chris Ware redefines comics and their possibilities through his formal experiment with layouts, panels, and the amount of visual information that he puts on a single page. And Chris Ware constantly describes his comics in architectural terms. So he describes it as an architecture of visual information that realigns seeing and reading. He's very fond of quoting Goethe's statement that architecture is frozen music, and he freezes similarly his panels in architectural stills that stall and disrupt narrative progression. At the same time, he also creates a space in a way of inner temporality within the panel itself, allowing for very discrete moments of time to unfold in this larger world of huge amounts of information. Georgina Benita, in her article on slowness and Crisware, invokes an image from Benjamin's Arcades project. In an era that was marked by major accelerations and temporal experience, Benjamin provides us with the image of strollers who moved in the shopping arcades of the 19th century cities. Some of them, he notes, walked with a tortoise on a lead. These flaneurs not only cultivated slowness deliberately, but they ensured that others took note of the fact in order to express their contempt for the machine age and its obsession with speed. The tenor and rhythm of Crisware's images also proceeds in small increments on the micro level of its individual panels in which characters take dizzyingly small steps. So, a very typical Crisware panel, nothing much happens. And this is a regular trope, right? So you have and Crisware really is the poet of kind of a fading Chicago, right? It's always about a certain kind of a Chicago that's disappearing. You can see this is one of his most famous characters, Jimmy Corrigan, and the trope of Superman, both as Nietzsche's Superman, which is the idea of Superman as God, but of course Superman is the god of comics as well. So in this one, it's Superman waving and committing suicide. Yeah? And again, the narrative progression, a lot of moves, but nothing really happens. And for many, many panels, Superman just lies dead as traffic moves about the building, the light in the building changes with the passage of time during the day, etc. So this deliberate kind of slowing down, but using also a very, very complicated and nuanced logic of laying out. So if you were to just recall Goldstein's argument of the spatio-temporal dynamics of comics and the arthology of comics, Crisware is the master of it. This, for one, is Quimby the mouse. Again, it seems like a sweet, childish kind of a thing, but Quimby the mouse is like this Siamese twinned mouse, where one of the twins grows old while the other doesn't grow old. Now recall Nietzsche's idea of the untimely. The untimely not as a progression of time from linearity of growing young to old, but what does it mean to grow young and old at the same time, right? So, in his latest work, which is an absolutely challenging and marvelous work, which looks more like a game than a comic book, Building Stories, is literally both about buildings and stories and their relationship to each other. When you open it out, there are 14 little things that come about, but at the heart of Building Stories is a building, very literally. And it's about various characters, but one particular character is a disabled woman who lives in the building. So this is what happens when you open out Building Stories. There is a box, there is a central kind of a game board in a way that structures the entire narrative. There are little fold-outs that emerge, and all of them are linked to each other. But to give you two images from it, this is the opening image of the main story, which is really that of the building. The building speaking about this woman or the girl who's looking at her. And there's this kind of contemplative thing that you should have seen me in my heydays, now I'm 98 years old, etc., etc. And then the next panel is a very, very detailed kind of, history in a way of the entire building collapsed as an experience or as an archive of various affects. The number of breakups that happened, the number of kind of, things that were stolen, the number of orgasms that took place in the building. And I just wanted to play you one small segment as you enjoy and savor some of the details, which is Crisware talking about the building itself as a character.
One of the most remarkable characters in Building Stories is the building itself. And the building has its own soul. The building loves the pitter-patter of pink feet and keeps track of how many people live there, how many pregnancies, removed radiators, squashed bugs, telephone calls, orgasms, punches, screams, breakfasts, and so on. What made you decide to give the character of the building such a realness, such a humanity?
Well, on one hand, it is the sort of self-conscious creative construction on the part of the woman to write for her creative writing class. It's one of those big ideas that you try when you're a beginning writer or artist that sometimes can go horribly wrong, but then other times can somehow open up possibilities of feeling that you might not otherwise have expected. So, and on the other hand, it's just simply something I am interested in and think about a lot. I think about what, the history of a building and the things that have happened within it. it sounds crazy, but if you start thinking about a building, it can almost start to seem like a living organism through time. My friend Tim Samuelson, who's the cultural historian of the city of Chicago, really genuinely feels empathy for buildings and for what they've experienced through various generations, and that he's been a big influence in my life in that way.
So Chris Ware constantly discusses and his reliance on architecture as a kind of a shorthand for explaining different kinds of reading strategies required to navigate a page. But if Chris Ware's work speaks to Benjamin's idea of the flaneur, we have another figure, which is that of the collector, that informs the works of Sarnath Banerjee. Sarnath Banerjee, arguably the most famous of India's kind of, comic artists, etc., invokes the idea of the collector and brings him into conversation with the figure of the flaneur. Wong Kar-wai once said that if you ever saw his film Chungking Express, then you would never get lost in Hong Kong. He intended, in other words, for the film to be a map of the city. Extending the metaphor of the map, I would suggest that Sarnath Banerjee's work, Corridor and the Barnhouse Wonderscapers, serve as street-level maps of affective and sensual urban encounters. This is not necessarily a map for newcomers or for tourists, but an intimate map for those who live in these cities, but by virtue of living constantly in them, have come to take them for granted. To borrow the title of Madhur Naslim's book, Sarnath Banerjee creates a map for lost lovers. Just as a camera allows us to see too much, city dwellers are accustomed to seeing too much as a result of which we don't see enough. And comics, in a way, can bring us back in a way like Asterios Polyps to our own blind spots and to our own kind of perceptual experience of urban spaces. At one level, Corridor is literally about the making and breaking of relationships. At another, it is really about what it means to wander, to get lost, and to find your way back in a city like Delhi or Calcutta. If it works effectively as a compass, it also works equally effectively as a chronograph. A chronograph, as many of you know, is a watch that allows for the measurement of simultaneous time. It's that New York, London, Bombay kind of thing, right? The seconds hand, the minutes hand. It's something that allows you in a way to measure different levels of speeds, intensities, durations, and potentials in the experience of time itself. So if you take one of the images, north of Daryaganj is an altogether different planet. Here the immeasurably old rub shoulders with the very new. For me, Sarnath Banerjee has his finger on a pulse that a number of us have experienced as what I would describe as the long 50s through the 90s. The middle class experience of a simultaneous lack and an aspiration for a global modernity which was somehow just out of your reach, or the space between Midnight's children and Midnight's grandchildren. We know this. We are that generation, right? We've been through the Doordarshan and the lack years to now seeing, of course, this hyper-proliferation. So in the Harappan Files, for example, he has this thing where he says, as children growing up in the third world, we made it our business to know. And here's a range of examples, right? What is the capital of like Angola? What is it? And everyone just knows these things. And foreigners are always remarkably kind of surprised by how much we know. And why is it that we know all these insane amounts of data? So we knew that what the capital of Tonga was and how many medals Nadia Comaneci had won at the Montreal Olympics. Education for us was what boxing must have been for the black man. And there's this image of it. Right? So in Sarnath's work, the city exists as a space which contains the delights and contradictions of the passage between the time of the national modern and global contemporaneity. A Benjamin whose shadow hovers over a corridor chose the passageways of 18th century Paris. Sarnath Banerjee begins with the mimetic passageways, the arcades of Connaught Place in Delhi, but very quickly moves into the bylanes and the back alleys. This coexistence of the old and the new in Sarnath's work is expressed in the continuities and differences between the old city and the new city, and if the social sciences have recycled the idea of tradition versus modernity, West versus non-West to a boring depth, what Sarnath Banerjee offers us instead are a series of vignettes in which the paradox of Indian modernity is not experienced as a source of anxiety, but as an ordinary, quirky, and extremely funny thing. All the protagonists are middle-class people who undergo a heroic journey through the streets to arrive at a better self-knowledge or a transformed knowledge of the ordinary. So Corridor begins with the quest for a book. And which brings kind of, one of the central protagonists, Jahangir Rangoonwala, an old bookseller who occupies the outer circle of Connaught Place, but rightfully considers it to be the center of the universe. What does it mean, in other words, to be in the margins or in the peripheries of modernity, but consider yourself to be the center of the universe? And the three characters who come together in the book are both all people who come looking for a book. And recall Benjamin's statement in Unpacking My Library, how many cities have unfolded themselves to me in my quest for old books. So one of the episodes that I want to focus on is that of Shintu Baba's search for pornography and for guides, because he somehow feels that he has a sexual problem because he just cannot last as long as the people he sees in porn films. So there must be a genuine problem. He initially thinks this is a problem of acidity because Bengali. So but he realizes that acidity may not be the problem, and that leads him into the streets and the gullies of Old Delhi. Right? So. And you can see that there are all these various maps which are also incorporated, but literally you can see the map in the movement in the comic, which begins with the outer circle of Connaught Place and moves to Old Delhi via Turkman Gate, the edge of Meena Bazaar, north of Daryaganj, and finally into Chandni Chowk. Right? That's the thing. So, so this book there becomes key. That's the key to Shintu's transformation. He finds a book called Message of Youth, right? There's a muscular guy holding it. Now, what is this book? Turns out that there is actually an image of the book in the book itself. And these again are not linear, I've brought them kind of together. Now, the book then leads him to this very strange character, which flows from, this kind of like, image of the tap and the preservation of water as some kind of metaphor of the preservation of semen and all of this, into a modern candy that unfolds into a turbaned gentleman who turns out to be Hakim Gulab Khuzras Peshawari, a sexologist who gives Shintu all kinds of very, very useful advice. Have pure thoughts, urinate before sleeping, don't think of girls, boycott love thoughts, don't ride bicycles. While passing bowels, first pass urine and then stool. After that, practice stool in first and then urine, that whole range of things which allows you to kind of reach this great state of vitality. And the last advice, very crucial, no sex during constipation. Right? Now, question that I have is, let's go back to this book, The Message of Youth, and try to think of who is this person. I try to unravel who this kind of turban gentleman was and what this secret of this book was, and it turns out that there is actually a book called Jivan Sandesh written by Hakim Hari Krishan Lal. Now, who is Hakim Hari Krishan Lal? Anyone who has walked around Daryaganj or many parts of North India, any towns, will find that he's a very, very famous sexologist. And the Hakim Sahib runs something called the Shafa Khana in Daryaganj. Right? Now, for those of you who are laughing at the Hakim Sahib, the next slide will ensure that you stop laughing, because this is the Hakim Sahib with Nehru, Sarojini Rajguru, Radhakrishnan, Lal Bahadur Shastri, right down to Rajiv Gandhi. Is this a photoshopped image? No, it's not. So is the Hakim then the Zelig come, Forrest Gump of India? Is he the underbelly in a way of a certain kind of an Indian public modernity which has never admitted its secret? So Nehru to Rajiv Gandhi have all obviously read the Hakim, but we don't know about this. Sanjay Srivastava, in his work on street pornography and on the entire informal economy of sexual knowledge in the country, describes this as an aura of a secret but public modernity, silent but thick through its circulation. And he maps out all of these sexology clinics to see that where they are normally located are primarily in most of the major transport nodes in different parts of the city. So generally big bus stands, railway stations, outlying colonies, or older commercial localities such as Chandni Chowk. The people who visit these are primarily migrant working class laborers, and a lot of the usual problems that you have are both the virility, erectile dysfunction, etc., but also things that move into the domain of problems in relationships. So this line between, as it were, the physiological, the psychological, all of it gets entirely blurred. And in his work on street pornography, he also says that literature like this, which is the Jivan Sandesh book, are extremely common, right? Street literature, which also serve as nodes of further knowledge. So for example, a lot of them would have advertisements, and he gives a sample of the kind of advertisements that you find in these kind of street parchas. So a phone from Gaya in Bihar advertises for a ring which is capable of giving its wearer complete control over any man or woman, can ensure success in business, legal matters and exams, a good job, marriage according to personal wish, protection against bad spirits, success in lottery and gambling, freedom from debt, the ability to see buried treasures and dreams, bad graha, will improve power of memory, will recover lost goods, and health will improve generally. 51 rupees, tantric ring. Second object, colorful photo album. Despite possessing physical beauty, millions around the world are unhappy. Many pictures of smiling women contains many things worth knowing both before and after marriage. Third, sure ways to increase height based on many successful experiments in America and Europe. Fourth, judo and karate techniques based on Japanese techniques that can be bought through VP Ashok Prakash and Chandni Chowk. Fifth, a mala with 108 beads which takes away all your troubles, cast spells, spirit possession, pass exams, be rid of debts, succeed in businesses, make debtors forget your debt, will refund your double to cost if not satisfied. Six, a new 35mm camera from Gupta Trading Company. 7, genuine spells for putting people under your control. Genuine crow magic, ancient owl magic, mantra for worldly successful card tricks. Then Suhagra course with pictures. Finally, learn to speak English in 30 days. How do we think about this world of the objects? And Sarnath Banerjee's corridor is literally, in a way, both a guide to the city as well as a compendium precisely of these borderline objects and borderline knowledges. If Parthacharyaji's distinction between civil and political society were mapped onto a sexual terrain, what we would have is the equivalent in a way of a biopolitical society as opposed to the civil sexual contract that underwrites, as it were, kind of the political order. We again see the influences of Benjamin on Sarnath Banerjee, where Benjamin's aphoristic snapshots of Paris in the 18th century really blurred the lines between the actual city and its mythological topography. David Frisby, for example, says of Benjamin that he intended to construct a topography of Paris not merely of its monuments and ruins, but of its mythology. And one of the key strategies for Benjamin was the idea of dialectical thinking. The moment of awakening when dream and reality overlap, the realization of dream elements in waking is the textbook example of dialectical thinking. And for him, dialectical thinking is the organ for historical awakening. So each epoch not only dreams the next, but also the dream strives towards the moment of waking. You'll see in a lot of the segments in the Barnaul's Munderscapers, this line between the waking and the dreaming. So the protagonist goes into Writer's Building, the famous kind of administrative heart of Calcutta, and finds his grandfather's ghost hovering over the city, right? And this entire idea of what it means to kind of deploy this idea of the dialectical, where the past in a way erupts into the present, where the line between past and present, the line between collective memory as well as official memory gets all blurred, right? In the Barnaul, Sarnath deploys a mix of photorealism with a world of drawings as a way of blurring the distinction between urban memory, urban fiction, and urban mythology. Rather than seeing the history of the city as a teleological one from colonial to the contemporary, Calcutta in Sarnath's work is a space where various competing versions of history and memory clash and coexist. Navigating the city as an archive consists of constantly peeling through an overlapping palimpsest of personal, social, and official memory. Right? A couple of images from Sarnath's work, and you can see again similarities between certain elements of Chris Ware's unfolding of time, but using photographs in his work. And through a mixing of the speculative kind of historical fiction, which is drawn in with the photorealism, which actually indexes real spaces in the city, and the photographs that are merged with drawings, Sarnath Banerjee creates a tribute to urban experience, which is cognizant both of its monumental histories cast in stone, as well as of their incorporation in stories, rumors, and sensation. The Barnaul eventually becomes an archive that celebrates the continued presence of the past in urban landscape, even as it is able to float free of it as an overwhelming kind of burden. And I will end with my last kind of thing. I'm running out of time, so I won't talk about it much. This is Amitabh Kumar's Tinker Soldier Tap, which is really in some ways a story of urban infrastructure of cities like Delhi in the last 10 to 15 years. If you recall Matthew Arnold's On Dover Beach, the poem begins with this line, which is, the sea is calm tonight, and ends with where ignorant armies clash by night. And the progression in the poem is really about the progression from the calm sea to this ignorant armies clashing by night. Amitabh Kumar's Tinker Soldier Tap begins with this very sparse image. And the rest of the poem is really an working out of how a number of ways in which in the last decade and a half, the line between urban infrastructure and media infrastructure is completely blurred. The bleeding, as it were, of ordinary, cheap, quotidian media into urban infrastructure, where every aspect of urban life is now governed in a way by an encounter with a media form, is really what this kind of comic seeks to do. So this, for example, is again speaking to a memory that a number of us has, which is that of the purchase of the first VCR, right? So it describes this magical thing that happens when the VCR comes into one's house, and all of a sudden the space is transformed because the entire neighborhood lands up in your house to watch films, or you hire a VCR for 24 hours. So it documents this kind of slow transition from cassettes to VCRs to mobile phones, DJs, the rise of the internet, etc., and layers this really on the initial image that one had of this kind of open space, empty space, etc. So that by the end of the novel, by the end of the comic, and there are a couple of images that have that index the real, the map of the city now changed for Sushant, Shrikant, Anand, and Deepak. And in what way does it change? By the end of the comic, what you have is an urban infrastructure which is really built in a way out of this ordinary electronic modernity, right? What I'll do is there's much more that I had, but I've already overshot my time. So let me end with just 2 or 3 thoughts. One, clearly there is a need in a way for a lot more serious engagement with comics, especially in terms of specific entry points. Today we've explored one, which is the intersection between urban imagination and comics. But with comics arriving and kind of doing what they do, I think it really makes the work of filmmakers a lot harder. I think that the burden on filmmakers to justify such an expensive medium, which at the end of the day is saying very little. You do not have films that are able in a way to justify their existence any longer if comics are able to do it much cheaper. That's my provocative argument. The second thing I want to say is that just as an aside, there is an attempt to perhaps create a reading group around comics. There's a very, very interesting initiative in Indranagar, a shop and a cafe called Leaping Windows, where a lot of the comics that I have referenced will be, you can borrow from there, because comics are also not cheap. They're a pretty expensive medium. But I think there's a fair amount of excitement given the potential of what's happening in comics as well as in comic studies, and I think we're only touching the tip of the iceberg. But it's great to be in that incipient moment when you can see a discipline emerging slowly. What it now needs is a much larger community. So sorry for overshooting my time, but thanks for the patient kind of hearing.
There's so much richness in what you said and what you put out there. Not the least is the slightly Freudian challenge between castration and sterilization, which I think it gave a renewed haunting of the 75 moment to several of us. I'll just say one quick thing before I open it up to the audience is, I'm struck actually in some sense by your multiple evocations of Benjamin, right? Because I think one of the things that's interesting about, and particularly putting it next to the idea of Sarnath as a chronicler of a certain kind of modernity that escapes the nation state kind of frame. And partly because Benjamin, whatever you say his name, wrote about the arcade also as a symptom to read capitalism. Right? And very much wrote about the abandoned Parisian shop as a fossil. So in a way, he was reading the city for clues, actually in a very much a way in which Engels writes about a first set of experience that comes out as text. But one of the arguments that was interesting about a Benjaminian dialectic was that the visual nature of his cues very much changed the way he then approached the history of historical materialism. And it goes back, I think, to the sense of, again, are we just talking about medium, or does reading visually also mean a different kind of theorizing, a different kind of epistemology? So are we really asking an epistemic question here, not just one of saying, am I making the same argument through text or through image? And I think there's something really at stake there to mine, especially if we take comics seriously, in sort of a conversation between Partha Chatterjee read in text and Partha Chatterjee read in this kind of print. And and I think this very much that sense of a new set of comics that I think, are taking on a certain intellectual location and mantle and claiming it for themselves that they didn't necessarily do in the Indian context. I'm thinking of the recently launched, as of last week, This Side, That Side, the graphic novel on narratives of partition that was just launched in Delhi last week. And very much a claim, not just that here are these stories of partition, but a claim saying that the stories of partition can be told visually in a way that other mediums cannot tell those stories. Because there is a way in which, if you want to get at that guttural experience, that only the visual will do. So, and I heard that claim made very forcefully at the launch last week. So it's something, I think, 2 questions I wanted to park with you. And let me now open it up, and maybe we'll take 2 or 3 responses or comments at a time and give Lawrence a chance to respond. And I'll pass you a mic, so if I can, feel free to jump in at any point, especially if you're a filmmaker who's been asked to think about your budget and existence.
Oh, I didn't even start on that. So
very illuminating, Lawrence. When you were talking about temporality being reflected in the gutters and the different perspectives, I was thinking of the flip book that we used to get when we were younger, where you were essentially in control of the time in which you spent in flipping through the book, and it told a story on its own. Have you found instances of flip book comics, of flip book renderings of such media, and how do they compare with the temporality rendered by the gutters or the absence of them?
yeah, let me begin with yours and move to Gautam's. The flipbook is actually, interestingly, was a way of kind of bypassing precisely what was seen as the problem of temporality of picture books, in that they did not have movement, right? So the idea of flickering, which is in a way kind of dependent on what cinema also relies on, because cinema is effectively a very fast kind of flick books, and that's, cinema actually takes its name, the idea of flicks, movies as flicks, comes from the flick book, right? It's one of the, part of the early histories of various kind of technologies of producing in a way the illusion of movement, right? So in a way, flick books were the opposite of comics in that they sought to introduce movement into the domain of the still image. But there are a number of artists who are attempting in a way to try to figure out a relationship between these various levels or degrees of temporality. So you will have artists, for example, who accelerate. And a lot of this, for example, in action comics or in superhero comics would rely on certain kind of images of movement, right? So the most famous example of this is that how do you in a comic show hypervelocity? In other words, is a comic the best mode of articulating, Flash, the fastest man in the world, right? I mean, a comic is a static form. It was not meant to kind of, articulate Flash. So the invention of the Flash clearly was the shadowy after presence, right? Which is dependent in a way on how the eye functions. SV, what is the name of the technical term of the persistence of vision? Persistence of vision is basically because of the fact that your eye does not, in a way, work as quickly as the machine can move images. What you are really seeing as movement is really dependent on the idea of the persistence of vision. Now the persistence of vision then becomes in the history of comics the shadow, the double outline that gives you an illusion of movement even in a single panel. Now that comes back to cinema via, for example, bullet time in The Matrix. So the Wachowski brothers were both comic artists before they became filmmakers. And when they wanted to slow down time, what they did in The Matrix was to go back to comics to look at the persistence of vision and the shadow. So if you remember Matrix, when Neo is doing all his dances, what you're really seeing is a comic form, right? But now as a moving image. So I think one of the important things, or one of the challenges for the future, is really to think about this not in terms of medium specificities, but how do we think about the ways kind of intermediate challenges posed by the blurring of the boundaries between, let's say, the internet, comics, film, etc. And that's a separate talk altogether. 2 points that you raise, the Benjamin point, and the second is, how do comics think? Or is there something specific to the idea of comics as a form of thought? And I think this is a crucial challenge, right? Because if one were to take the idea of the drawing seriously, in terms of if the drawing is indeed a mode of expression and a mode of thought, and not just a mode of expression, but a mode of thought, it harks back to debates around the question of language and representation. Is language merely a tool of representation? No, Wittgenstein says it's a form of life itself, which means that there is no kind of a priori idea that exists that then finds its expression via language. And I think a lot of the serious comic artists would also argue the same. That very often, if you think of this only as a representational medium, then you limit your analysis to representational analysis, right? But if you were to actually think about it in terms of what it is that drawing produces as a mode of thinking, like what is the new idea that's generated by the drawing, not outside of the drawing or in the drawing, but generated through the act of drawing itself, that becomes the challenge. So it's not so much then about the text-image relationship. The text-image relationship is one that, for example, even in the works of people like Chris Ware, he says we haven't even begun to use text in comics. We have words, but we don't have text yet. There's a difference in the way that the comics works in terms of what it's able to kind of show and what it's able to tell. And a lot of the comics that we have tell you a lot. They tell you a lot because of the visual information overload that you have, but they don't show you much yet. And in this challenge of what it means to show is the formal kind of challenge. Now the question that you have asked is also kind of linked in a way to the, the political consequences of the medium, the Benjaminian kind of question. And I think that one of the things that I was attempting to do in the talk was to show that there is no line between the two. That if this is one of those absolute blurrings of form and content, comics have that potential of doing it. Because all its kind of, formal, political, ethical concerns, as you see in the works of someone like Chris Ware, which is really about a certain kind of living in, not necessarily nostalgia as a bad term, but nostalgia as a politically good term, as an opposition to what he sees as the kind of unthoughtful gentrification, or what he describes as the arrogant sexuality of modern cities, right? Which is this idea that cities have to compete at a level of the libido, right? So it does this by recalling a kind of a heightened appeal to the senses. Every city wants to grab your attention more than the other, and it thinks it can do this by building greater buildings, building taller buildings, building malls, glass buildings, etc. So what he pays attention to is a constant returning to the ignored aspects of urban history by looking at old houses, by looking at old architecture, and in a way kind of inserting that into the heart of contemporary experience. That, for me, is connected, of course, to the Benjaminian kind of idea of the dialectic image, right? The other thing which is interesting for me is that when Benjamin talked about the Arcades project, what he did alongside a critique of the large, symptom of capitalism was to uncover figures of thought and figures of practice that constantly produce contradictions within the capitalist system itself. So alongside, the Arcades project, you also have, of course, the figure of the rag picker. You have the figure of the collector, you have the figure of the flaneur, all of whom are in a way kind of negotiating their relationship not so much to commodity culture, but to objects, right? Because if commodity cultures are marked by, the twin kind of principle of either use value or exchange value, objects are marked by an investment of a fancier's value, or a collector's value, which is somehow outside of the use exchange value kind of contradiction. And I think a lot of the comics like of Sarnath also kind of does something similar. So.
Apart from Hannah, I haven't seen too many female protagonists, and I'm just wondering, also just this visual, it's very male. Could you comment as why some of the gendered aspects of the city, or even the comics that you've chosen, just render women a little bit invisible or even instrumental in the male journey?
Okay.
Even in the sexual stories or the sexuality that was explored,
Yeah.
It was very male.
Yeah. Uh-oh. It's that question.
Save you from it for half a second, because I think one.
Yeah, Lawrence, brilliantly counterintuitive. At a time when we're talking about media convergences and multimedia formats and the resolution of celluloid and non-celluloid, celluloid into several other forms and so on, you're actually making the case for any mobile form as in some ways perhaps the most representative or the most useful point of entry into these 21st century, which is too fast and too furious. Now, 2-3 provocations that you took up, let me just sort of cussedly get back and again, in order to take the conversation forward, look at the the kid stuff. You know, what kind of comics, or shall we say animation actually? I mean, Chota Bheem, homegrown, and Ninja Hattori, imported. Ninja Hattori is so old that nobody in Japan watches it anymore, or nobody in Japan has watched it from the 80s or something like that. So it's interesting that the kind of comics that you picked up are precisely really the vanguard of the comic world. Okay, so in which case some of the heavy-duty theorization of it is of the kind that you could make of, you know, any art form. Just as every art form would have its own unique take on the contemporary. Now, so therefore, I mean, and again, I take your disclaimer. I mean, I want to remind myself that you did say that it's impossible to speak of comics as one thing. Right? You're obviously taking an argument forward and picking on specific examples. Okay. Now, suppose you look back at the DC comics and again look at what is the worth of a comic strip, and if you were to say that, you know, the comic strip really is a script idea. What it is a script idea. I mean, you know, it is doomed to be you know, a billion-dollar blockbuster. So then look at again, you know, the nostalgia part which you actually spoke, and if we are looking at the avant-garde comic, as it were, as you know, looking at the underbellies of our cities and so on, and the more mainstream, or shall we say the more, I mean, in your scheme of things, perhaps the more boring one, as curiously harking back to a past which is no longer there, which is, you know, nostalgia for a past we didn't experience. You know, Chota Bheem would be my number one example of that. You know, the idyllic countryside and these beautiful green pastures and so on and so forth. So between the two, then, you know, do we have really a project in terms of what we said?
I think the easy question was the gender one is always the tough one. Huh? So on the question of the popular versus the high art aspect of it, I think in fact there is a fair amount of work, not necessarily in India, but in terms of American popular culture, a fair amount of work on in India there is some amount of work. Nandini Chandra's work on the Amar Chitra Katha comics, very important work, but in a predictable, Hindutva nationalist ideology kind of mode, doesn't actually deal with any of the kind of there are some really interesting kind of, artists in the history of Amar Chitra Katha, I think, whose work needs to be uncovered. I think one of the problems is not so much about the vantage point in terms of are you entering from avant-garde or popular, as much as the fact that you don't even have the groundwork, right? You don't even have an archive of the popular in the way that you do for cinema that currently exists. The rare exception in terms of academic scholarship on this is Gyan Prakash's Mumbai Fables, which has an entire chapter on Raj comics. The Raj comics is the epiphenomena of comics in India, right? They are responsible for Doga, they are responsible for Nagraj, the two great superheroes, and all of them are really about urban experiences. So Gyan has a wonderful chapter, which is why I didn't talk about any of these other comics, about Raj comics and the history of Bombay in the 90s. Absolutely terrific stuff. I think the larger question really is in terms of, what it is in terms of the object of research or the object of knowledge that we're thinking through. Because of the fact that this is so incipient, because of the fact that you don't even have the formal methodological tools as you did in terms of an intellectual history in film studies, we're grappling, right? So I think it's too early to arrive at any settled kind of an argument, and I think part of the reason, for my moving away from my private pleasures of comics to even talking about it publicly is I think that it is important to build that intellectual community around comic cultures now. And this is only a formalist reading that I've done so far. You also have the entire socio-historical, history of comics. You have the ideological approach. You have the ethnographic accounts of comic reception. None of that exists in the Indian context at the moment, right? So it's very, very, very new. So I think, I'm open to suggestions on where this might lead as a research or as an inquiry. And of course, we have to open ourselves to the usual accusation that Hamara last domain of fun, these academics have also taken away. That will happen. We can't help it. Gender. Now, Yeah, so if I didn't bring the gender dynamics, I'm sorry about that. I just don't know enough, right? In the sense that if you were to take, for example, the account of the feminist recreation in a way of the flaneur, I don't know if there's a comic equivalent that I can identify with. But if there is one thing that one cannot accuse comics of, it is the standard account of the problem of gender that you have in a lot of media. For the simple reason that comics have always been, in a way, and very interesting space in which a lot of gender dynamics in terms of, the politics of the kinds of representation that you never saw in any other media was allowed in comics. And that's because of the superhero and the woman superhero, right? And for me, my greatest hero or superheroine of all of this is Wonder Woman. Wonder Woman was the creation of this completely wacko Harvard doctor who, amongst other things, had invented the polygraph, the lie detector, right? He created the polygraph, but no one actually believed the polygraph, and the polygraph was not admitted into courts of law as admissible evidence. So to resolve that problem, he created Wonder Woman. He also happened to be a proto-feminist who was majorly into bondage. So you take Wonder Woman, what is Wonder Woman's weapon? It's the truth lasso, right? Under the grips of which you cannot tell a lie. So you can see this entire kind of thing, but what you have are these, now no one has really spoken about the history of Wonder Woman in relation to this kind of, the history of proto-feminist kind of movement. So I think there's a whole bunch of super interesting stuff that has to be done on it. Amachitra Katha, you have the standard critique, right, of the kind of semi-sexualized, goddesses, etc., with their curvaceous, seductive, religious appeal, right? And let's forget all of that and let's see what are the other spaces that we can uncover. I don't know. I'm open to the idea of what we can do. Whole range of very interesting feminist kind of, comics. Alison Bechdel, I showed a small example of, but Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, as well as her Dykes to Watch Out For, as well as, Are You My Mother, are fantastic examples of the entire kind of, queer representational, queer autobiographical space that has emerged in comics. The entire idea of the fucked out autobiography is the rage in comics right now, right? Everyone talks about illness, everyone talks about disability, and everyone talks about, kind of marginalized identities, but in ways which were not like watching a documentary about the same. Otherwise, we would be bored to death. So why is Fun Home able to do what it is able to do? Because Fun Home strikes you like a blow, right? Her father's repressed queer sexuality and her own nascent emergent kind of lesbianism that she recognizes is articulated only in one moment, and that's the moment of that picture that I showed you. This picture of the naked man reclining, or the semi-naked man reclining, which her father has. Incredible stuff. Bechdel is also responsible for the Bechdel test, which, about is there any conversation in media that happens without some derogatory / reference to women, etc. So, yeah, but, again, everything has to be done. It hasn't happened yet.
Two questions actually. I want to know, it's like, how can we now understand the relationship between comic-inspired animated movies like Paprika and Sin City and all these things, and you said like you commented something on the medium specificity, and I want to understand medium specificity, especially in the context of the reading experience. It's like, because comics are also moving online, and in the earlier part of your talk you pointed out the materiality of the comics in a way. It's like and for me, the immediate connection that I could make was, it's like how we read and receive comics. If I were to scroll a screen and read a comic there, and maybe where panel and gutter are retained, where panel and gutter are removed and the scrolling down happens like in oatmeal comics, that kind of, it's like, and how do we analyze or understand these different reading experiences itself? Though you said something about medium specificity, I didn't get it. If you could elaborate more on that. Yeah.
On the first point, which is on the translation of comics into film. In the last 10 years, most of the major blockbusters that we know, at least from Hollywood, are all comics that have been made into films, right? The problem, of course, is how do we understand this? Is this, for example, what theorists would describe as a remediation? The remediation is the afterlife of certain media forms in other mediums, right? Or is this merely an adaptation? Because if you were talking about a remediation, then one necessarily has to, in a way, try to replicate the formal qualities of comics when one makes the film. but you immediately have a problem. The problem is simply that of all films, take for example 300, which is a remake of the Frank Miller story, in a crucial sequence which is that of the narration of the coming of age of the boy. In the comic, the narrator moves in and out, and that's crucial because it's really about motivating this bunch of warriors, etc. The film version becomes a linear kind of a movement. Why? Because you don't have panels. Now you have some films which have attempted to replicate the look and feel of comics. For example, Ang Lee's Hulk. Ang Lee's Hulk has multi-frames, windows within windows, right? The multi-screen. What is the problem with that? The problem with that is that they're all occupying the same temporal unit. So it's about different perspectives of the same time. So this is what's happening in the police control room, this is what's happening on the street, this is what's happening in the laboratory, but they're all unfolding in the same time. But in the comic, they're not unfolding at the same time, they're discrete temporal moments. The only successful remediation that I've seen is that of Harvey Pekar's American Splendor, especially in the opening sequence and in the sequence which replicates, his, because what it does is that it actually combines the movement of film along with the static movement of the comic. So there are moments where it literally becomes a comic, it merges drawing with the live shooting, etc. And that's the rare exception that I've seen. Otherwise it doesn't really work. On the question of the subjectivity of reading experiences, I mean, what is unique to the experience of comic reading is the fact that there is almost as it were an agonistic relationship between the reader and the text, because the first thing you encounter is totality. Then you move into the linear reading from left to right, looking at the unfolding of the image. But the problem is the image has an accelerated temporality because it arrives at you and grabs you by the throat immediately, so you see it. But the text takes time to read. So when you're reading the text, the image has already captured your attention. So the argument of the reader's kind of appropriation in a way of meaning in comics has been based on the grounds that you make your own time. The time, for example, that you choose to spend with an image, as opposed to the text, is something that you determine. The artist will base it on the idea of either overlaying too much text or laying no text, depending on what they want you to do. But at the end of the day, it's very, very much about a subjective experience of that kind. That is a medium specificity. As we move to the world, for example, of online comics, what you have emerging is something very, very, very interesting. And we haven't even seen the beginnings of this in any serious way, which is the idea to have the margins of a page any longer, but can roll out like a scroll. It almost takes us back in a way to the prehistory of comics, because the prehistory of comics is really about scroll drawings, that unfolded a certain kind of a narrative. What it allows you, in other words, is the idea of a reorientation of depth and the idea of perpetual space. What perpetual space does to narratives, we don't know yet, but that's the exciting place that comics is going to.
On that note, join me in thanking Thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to see you back at IIHS.